Hi, Carrie Ann here from the Science Booth, and today we're thinking about reproduction in flowering plants. And here I've got my lily. Now for this experiment, I recommend using lilies, daffodils or tulips just because they've got really big reproductive organs. And what I mean by that is we've got massive bits sticking out here and here, and they're the bits we are going to be looking at. Now I've had these lilies for a few days, so they're already in bloom, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter if they're bloomed or not. I'm going to be showing you one that's in bloom and one that's still closed, because actually it gives you a really good idea about all the different parts. Now to do this, I would recommend cutting your flowers either on a chopping board or a plate, and perhaps wearing some old clothes because pollen can be quite stainy, and also if you've got allergies or you've got cats, I don't think the lily pollen is very good for them. So I'm just going to cut this flower off here. So we've got a nice big flower here, and pollen has literally gone everywhere, and I'm going to cut this one off here. So we've got two different ones to look at. I'm going to move this lovely bunch of flowers to one side, and then I'm going to bring you down close up in a minute. So hopefully you have got your hands on some beautiful worksheets. There's an answer sheet and there's a sheet for you guys to fill in. So make sure you've got hold of that. Right then, I'm going to bring my camera down so you can see what I can see. So just bear with me. Always the fun bit. Okay. Now you should, just going to have a little peek, you should be able to see my plate quite well there. Okay, so now you can see we've got our two flowers on there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of the one that's in bloom for a second, and I'm just going to concentrate on the one that's not in bloom, and I'm just going to point out a few key features of this. Now I'm going to be using a scalpel today, just because that's what I'm used to using. But honestly, you can use scissors or a knife. It doesn't even have to be sharp, okay? So first thing that we can see on the flower, I'll just get rid of my scalpel for now. First thing we can see on the flower is that we've got a nice long stem and a leaf here, okay? And the leaf is a plant organ, and it's where all the photosynthesis will take part. Well, most of the photosynthesis anyway. Now, on the top of the stem, we've got these bits around the flower bud. And these bits around the flower bud are called sepals or sepals. Tomato, okay? And basically, these sepals on the flower are literally just for protection of the flower and everything that's inside it before it opens up. Now, what's a little bit misleading on a lily flower is that once they're open, the sepals actually end up looking just like the petals. So these three, 1, 2, 3, are actually the sepals, but they kind of mimic what the petals look like. So that's going to help attract insects to this flower, because the lily is an insect pollinated plant, and that's what we're looking at today. Okay, so before we look at our plant that's in bloom, I'm just going to have a go at cutting this one open. So it doesn't really matter if you've got a plant that's already in bloom or one that isn't, you'll still be able to do this. But like I said, I recommend using large flowers, or at least flowers that have got large reproductive organs. So even if your flower isn't open, you're still going to be able to open this out and see all the different things. Now I'm just going to open this one up just to show you a few bits, but then we'll dissect the one that's flowered just because everything's a little bit bigger. Okay, and what you should notice on a lily is that we might be able to get the sepals off. I've cut that petal in half, but you can see the sepals are on the outside. That's one sepal, and they're quite thick. Okay, we've got another sepal here. Just get rid of the petals inside. Sepal, 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 and you can see they're on the outside. Okay, on the inside, we've got some of these little things. We'll go into more detail in a minute. Okay, we should have 6 of these, but I'll look at them in more detail in a second. And the last thing you'll notice, I'm going to chop this one off, but again, we shall look at it in more detail shortly, is we've got one of these things. Okay, so if your flower is still closed, don't worry, you can still do it. If your flower is open, it'll just make everything a little bit easier. So I'm just going to get rid of all that to one side, and then I'm going to bring our blooming lily over. I'm going to bring our blooming lily, and we'll go through everything that's on here step by step. Okay, so we've already said we've got the flower stem or the stalk, which holds the flower in position, and at the base of that, okay, this is where the sepals and the flower, the petal, and all the different bits are going to grow from. Okay, so you can see that there, and have a good look at everything before you start taking it apart. And I reckon a lot of this dissection you will be able to do just with your hands. Okay, so I'm going to turn it upside down so I can kind of see a bit better what I'm looking at, and I'm going to remove the 3 sepals. So these will be the outermost petal looking organs. Okay, so those 3 there that I've put on the plate, they were our sepals. They were the protective layer around our lily, and I'm just going to put those around the outside edge of the plate so we can just see them. Okay, and that is literally their function, just to look after that flower on the inside. The next thing that we've got is we've got the petals, these 3 lovely petals. Now, depending what flower you're looking at, petals are often, I'm going to turn it upside down just so it's easier, petals are often brightly coloured, and they're usually scented as well. And the reason why they're brightly coloured or scented is in order to attract insects or birds towards the plant, towards the flower. Because once the insects or birds come towards that flower, the pollination process can begin. Okay, right, and now we can see we've got a few more things left on here. So let's start taking these off one by one. And again, I'm doing most of this just with my fingers. Okay, so I'm just going to take these off and we'll count them as we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Look at that, marvellous. So we've got 3 sepals, 3 petals, and 6 other things, okay? And these other things, okay, I'll hold this one a little bit closer. These other things are known as the stamen, and these are actually the male part of the plant. Okay, they're the male part of the plant, and they're made up of 2 parts. The stamen is made up of 2 parts. It's made up of this long filament here that grows from the flower stalk up the middle of the plant, and then on the end we've got the anther. Now you might not be able to see here, but you can see all these little speckles of orangey brown stuff I've got on my plate. The anther is where the pollen is produced, and this is the male bit of the flower. Okay, so this contains the male information or the male genetics. Okay, so that's the pollen, and pollen comes in all wonderful shapes and sizes depending on how it needs to be transferred. Is it going to be transferred by the wind, by an insect, by a bird, what shape of insect, how is it going to stick to the insect, and things like that. So pollen grains themselves are absolutely fascinating. So I'm just going to pop that there. Okay. The last little bit we've got on our plant is this central part, okay? And on this central part, we've got what we call the carpel. So all this, all around here, is known as the carpel, okay? And on the carpel, we've got lots of different things. We've got something on the top, okay? You might not be able to see it very well, but something on the top here, okay? This is a bit sticky. It might be sticky on your plant or not, okay? But this is known as the stigma, up here, the sticky stigma. We've then got this long thing here called the style. And then down at the bottom, we've got the ovary. And in the ovaries, this is where the ova or the eggs are produced, okay? So you can probably guess now that this is the female part of the flower. And again, I'm going to remove that and put that in the middle. Now, if you've got a really steady hand, you might be able to cut this open and you might be able to see something in the middle. I'm not making any promises. It depends, okay? But if we look in the middle, no, I've not got much going on in mine, but sometimes if it's very well developed, you can see the ova inside there and you can see the little eggs, okay? So, to recap just the different parts of the flower before we go on to what each of them does. We have got 1, 2, 3 sepals, and these are protection of the flower before it opens. And we've got 1, 2, 3 petals, which are often brightly coloured and or scented in order to attract insects or birds to help with pollination of the flower. We had 6 of these things here, 6 stamens, and each stamen is made up of an anther and a filament. Okay, the filament literally holds the anther up, and on the top of the anther we have got lots of pollen grains, which is the male part of the flower. Okay, in the middle we had 1 carpel, and the carpel is the female part, the female reproductive part of the plant, and it's got a sticky stigma on top. It's got a long style to hold the stigma in place. Then down at the bottom, it's got the ovary, which will contain the egg cells. Okay, so what we need to happen for a plant to reproduce, we somehow need to get the pollen grains down to the egg cells. Now this can happen on the same plant, and we'd call that self-pollination. Okay, so a flower can reproduce with itself essentially, or it can happen from a different flower, and that would be called cross-pollination, where a bit of pollen would blow or get transported by a bee or a bird from one flower to another flower. So if we look at that in a bit more detail, I think what is really useful is to then start thinking about turning some of these features into Play-doh models, because when we've got Play-doh, we can make things a little bit bigger and a little bit easier to see. So I've got some Play-doh that I was playing with earlier, and I'm going to bring that in now. Okay, so if you've got your worksheet, you can kind of work along with this now. So you can see I've made a little sort of reproduction of the diagram, but in Play-doh form. Okay, so just so we've not got a little bit lost, we'll see what different parts we've got here. We've got the brightly coloured scented petals. We've got the flower stalk. We've got the ovary, okay, containing little pockets called ovules, and you couldn't see these on my plant. And then inside the ovules, we've got the ova, or the eggs, these little yellow blobs here. So that's representing those things, okay? Now I haven't put on the male part of the plant just because I'm trying to keep it simple, okay? But what might happen is that some pollen might get carried along by a little bee, and a little bee might have a little bit of pollen on its leg, and it might have come to the plant to get some more nectar, and the nectar is usually down at the bottom of the flower, and the nectar is a sweet, sticky, yummy substance that insects want to eat, okay? But whilst they're doing that, what they're often doing is collecting pollen off the anthers from one plant, and sometimes dumping pollen onto the sticky stigma of another plant. So what might happen if a pollen grain gets deposited here, and I'm just going to squish that on, okay, we might get some pollen stuck to the sticky stigma of the carpel, of the female part of the plant, okay? Now, this is a Play-doh model and nothing's very much to scale. In reality, the eggs are much larger than the pollen. I'm just showing this as a little bit of an example to show pollination, okay? So if we were lucky enough to get a little pollen grain landing on the sticky stigma of a flower, what happens next is some information needs to be joined together. So we need to get information from the pollen, and it needs to join up with the information in the egg. Now, if you've done a little bit about cells, we're talking about nuclei here. Okay, if you've not done a little bit about cells, it doesn't really matter. But basically, a part of the cell called the nucleus needs to travel from the pollen down to the egg. And then those two things will join together to form the new part of the flower. Now, how we do that is the pollen will kind of grow a little pollen tube. Okay, so I've got my pollen tube, and again, much bigger than it really would be, but it's just so we can see it really easily. Okay, so we'd get a little pollen tube growing down from the pollen, and hopefully, I'm just going to squish this together, hopefully it would meet up and join up with one of the eggs. We'll go for the bottom one just because my pollen tube is quite long. Okay, so that pollen tube will grow from the pollen grain. Some information, or the nucleus, is going to travel down that pollen tube. It's going to join up and fuse. I'm trying to stick my Play-doh thing on. It's going to join up and fuse with the egg cell that's in there. Okay, and this is pollination. Okay, so when the pollen lands on the stigma of the flower, this itself is pollination. Okay, and hopefully, if that's successful, what will happen is that little cell that's now forming from the pollen and the egg will start to grow, and it will become an embryo, much like a baby would do. Okay, if a baby is growing, so that becomes an embryo and it develops. Okay, and the ovule that's containing the embryo becomes a seed, and then surrounding that seed, okay, surrounding the ovary, that would become a fruit. And it might be a soft and fleshy fruit, such as a peach, or it could be something like a dry, hard fruit, like a Brazil nut. Okay, so basically, when you're eating fruit, you're eating what's surrounding the start of a new flower, which I think is really, really cool. So I'm just going to lift you up now and bring you back into me. Bit of a camera wobble while we do that. Hello. Awesome. So, if you guys have got any questions, you can feel free to ask me about them. But you can see on this diagram, I'll show you the diagram without the answers on. It'll all be a little bit back to front to you, okay? But you've got a lovely diagram of a flowering plant, and this is focusing on pollination of insect pollinated plants or insect pollinated flowers. But we've got all the different parts of the flower. We've got some words down here for you guys to fill in. But guys, what I'd love to see is your pictures of your flower dissections, your models of your Play-doh pollination, and anything else you want to show me. And if you've got any questions, you can pop them in our Facebook group, or just pop me a little message or a little email. But guys, that was awesome. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.